is the notion of observer also a local phenomenon? Or can you have a non-local observer? Can a collection of observers be considered an observer?
An ant colony, for example. Yeah, I mean, yes, we have examples where, look, I mean, we humans are already extended. We're not observing things at the level of one atom of space. We are aggregating quite large chunks of sort of of elements of space and so on. Now, what would it be like to be an ant in an ant colony where you have sort of a collective mind about things? I'm not sure. Perhaps the true organism of the earth is all of human society. And then we're all just, ants relative to that. And you can say, what is the experience of the whole of human society? Human society makes decisions as we individuals make decisions. It makes decisions. We watch those decisions happen. Sometimes those decisions are pretty confusing for us individuals, so to speak. Society goes in this direction. They decide that, top hats are fashionable or something, and it happens as some sort of collective dynamic. And and we as an individual don't really know what happened there. And so I think this notion of, can society as a whole, for example, be thought of as an observer with respect to some kinds of questions? Probably yes. And in a sense, society, for example, this whole equivalencing question, you could ask that for society as a whole as opposed to individuals. You could say, we as individuals, we believe all kinds of different things, but society as a whole concludes that top hats are fashionable, for example. And that's just like it could very well be the case that in our brains, one part of our brain is saying, I hate that color. Another part of our brain is saying, I really like that color. And in the end, we come to a conclusion that is some kind of aggregate of those things where we say, hey, I kind of like that, or whatever. And I think, society does the same kind of thing. And we are in this, with respect to society, we are, with respect to, we are like the individual neurons in our brains. It's like if we could know what that individual clump of neurons was thinking, then we would say, oh my gosh, the whole brain made that crazy decision. This clump of neurons really had it right, but the whole brain did something completely crazy. And, so it is, I think, with us individual humans relative to all of society.
So humor me for a bit. Suppose the observer theory that you have would be able to give you a quantity like IIT has phi for this. You have 1,000 units of consciousness. An ant has 1. Okay, suppose we could do that. Suppose we could then say that a cell inside your body has 5 units of it in observer theory units, and that the aggregate of you has 1,000, and society actually has 10,000. Okay, suppose it was that. But then at the same time, earlier in the conversation, we have that the Ruliad is a bit too incoherent to give a consciousness number to, so maybe it's either 0 or undefined. That would seem to me like there's a maximum amount of consciousness at some point in some scale, because as you scale outward, you can get more. But if you scale too much, you get 0 or ill-defined. So what do you make of that? What would it be? What the heck would that be? The maximum, most conscious being?
I think it's one of these things where you sort of got a couple of parameters. You've got coherence, and you've got kind of the coherence of the being and what the being contains. And these things are directly related. The being sort of has a broader set of experiences, paradigms, whatever else. The being is also less coherent. As it can, have these two different points of view, let's say, which have certain incompatibilities, it is both by extending to be able to encompass those different points of view, it is encompassing more, but it is also becoming less coherent in what it encompasses. So, I mean, my own guess would be that I think it depends. Let's see. Usually the answer to a question like this is, it depends what you want it for. That is, If you say, which thing can make the maximum number of decisions per unit time, let's say, which thing can have the,
I understand.
it's you could have these different criteria, and I think you'd end up with a different answer,
I see.
which would
I
end
got
up
it.
being a reflection more of your criterion than of the thing itself. But I do think that, it is an interesting question. So, for example, the thought experiment. What if we gradually replace our neural circuitry with digital electronics, so we think 1,000,000 times faster? What would that feel like? Our experience of the physical world will be different in that case. We'll notice the individual photons coming in. We'll, not aggregate space in the same way. We'll have all kinds of other funky relationships, different relationships to physics. But, what would it be like to talk to an entity that was thinking 1,000,000 times faster than you were? I don't know. I think I suspect that the main point is that it can be spinning around and thinking really, really fast. But what matters to us is the way in which we connect to what's going on. And so actually the perception of what's happening wouldn't be so different, because what we're seeing is only those things that we can be an observer of, so to speak. All the detail about what it's thinking 1,000,000 times faster, it's coming up with this and that and the other. It's maybe what we would perceive of it. It's like perceiving something in physics, for example, where, lots of things are happening, but all we're perceiving is what we're capable of perceiving. So in other words, that the inner experience of the 1,000,000 times faster thinking thing would be invisible to us. And that when we talk to it, it would just seem like, all we're noticing is the things that we can notice, so to speak. Now, it's an interesting question. If you take, I don't know, things I've figured out in my life, and you imagine the 1,000,000 times faster version of me, then, again, it's like this connection to physics. Then, yes, you could say the things that, took me, the things that would take me a year to work out, the 1,000,000 times faster me would work out in 30 seconds. But I think that interface to that is like an interface to sort of physics. If viewed, the speed of light is the speed of light. We experience different things if we are experiencing it with kind of a different speed of thought. But I don't know. I mean, I think these thought experiments of what is it like to be an alien mind. I find them very interesting. I have a very hard time with them. I look to kind of almost, it's like, could you write a science fiction story which had as the protagonist, something that thinks 1,000,000 times faster? How would it think about things? How would other people feel about it? These are things which, and in a sense, by writing a science fiction story, you're trying to make that humanized bridge to our everyday experience. I wish more people were doing this. I think it's a really interesting thing to do. I think it's really hard.
If you enjoyed this toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for Toe Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core toe community. You'll also receive my top 10 toes. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.